I don't know why, but he declined. But he told me something that's very interesting. He said to me, I asked him a simple question. It was a trick question, actually. It was a loaded question. And I asked him, do we live in what is called a representative democracy, or do we live in a democracy? Obviously, I'm playing the game. And he said, well, that's a very complicated question. I said, well, it's not actually. It's either one or the other. And he said, well, democracy. Oh, right, thank you very much. Glad we cleared that one up. I said, I've been looking into the 1911 Parliament Act, it was research from my book, and I found something in there that says that we don't have a democracy whatsoever. And he said, oh, I'm very interested. He said, what's this then? I said, well, according to what I can see, that the 1911 Parliament Act set up the one-party majority within the House of Commons as a dictatorship, removing royal assent and removing the power of the Lords, which were the three sections needed for any act, legislation, supposed law coming into this country. I said, but according to this document that I have in my hand, this has happened and we are now being railroaded. The people of this island are being railroaded because of this document. He said, well, I absolutely agree with you. What? You're agreeing with me that there's a dictatorship within the House of Commons? Oh yeah, I'm agreeing with you. Oh, okay. I said, well, what about representation, playing the game? He said, oh no, there's no representation for the people. They're only there to represent the wishes of the elite. Now, I found this very fascinating. And this is true. This is one, I will not lie to you. This is honest truth. This man said this to me. And that's what I said, I'd love to meet you outside Parliament. He said, well, that wouldn't, we can't do that. I said, all right, fascinating. So I rang up Parliament again, and I spoke to a very nice young lady, because I wanted to find out about something called the Select Committee, or Committee of Selection it's called. Turns out when a bill's going through Parliament, the Speaker of Parliament will call 10 MPs as a select committee to look at amendments. They actually can create 10 of these. So I said to her quite simply, how is that reflected? She said, but it's reflected on the majority in the House at the time. What? So you're telling me that every select committee is biased towards the one-party majority within the House at the time? She said, yes. I said, hold on a minute. So you're telling me every select committee is actually biased to Labour? So they'll always go with what Labour says? She says, well, yeah, pretty much. And you call that democracy? Oh, well, she said, I can't really discuss this any further, which you get a lot when you're talking about these subjects. Especially when you start hitting the nail on the head. So, I'm like, hold on, I'm stunned by all this. I'm making these vocals, and I come into Hev, I said, you never believe what I've just had this conversation with Parliament. So anyway, I look a little bit deeper into the Parliament Act, and this is the Act here. Remember, this is part of our so-called constitutional protection. This document, it's one of the Acts. It's quite interesting because it says here on the left-hand side, it says, powers of the House of Lords as money bills. Now, I don't know if you know the history of this document. And this was at a time when there was a Prime Minister called Henry Herbert Asquith. And Henry Herbert Asquith was part of the Liberal Party. His right-hand man, he had two, David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill. They were trying to put through a bill called the People's Budget. In all intents and purposes, if you actually look at the People's Budget, it's a bloody good document. A really good document, but it was a smokescreen because they needed this. This is what they needed. So anyway, I don't know if you know this, but in 1910, when Edward VII was the king, there was two general elections. I don't know if you know this. There was one in January, one in December. Our first one in January ended up in a hung parliament. Do you know what hung parliament is? Yeah? There was no majority. it was bang on. The seats were contained within, equal seating. Asquith, with Lloyd George's help and Winston Churchill's help, presented to Edward VII the 1910 Parliament Act, which is, all intents and purposes, this document. Edward VII read it, supposedly, and said to Asquith, to put this document through will cause, or make this bill an act, will cause a constitutional crisis, and sent it back. I don't know if you know the process, but a bill comes into the House of Commons or the House of Lords or private members' bill. They're bounced about like this, and all the amendments are done, blah, 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 blah. Once it's done, the House of Commons puts what's called a Speaker's Certificate on it, and then it goes off to the Queen for her to put a moniker on it. Royal Assent, that's called. That's the three system, that's how it's meant to come in. When Edward VII sent it back, saying it would cause a constitutional crisis, because he realised what was wrote in this document. And what this document took away was the need for royal assent, and it actually took away the powers of the House of Lords to stop any bill coming through Parliament, no matter what they put through. They could put a bill through tomorrow that says that all blue-eyed babies on Tuesdays born at 10 o'clock have to be killed, and there is nothing that can stop them from doing it. Nothing. Because of this piece of paper. But would you accept that? So why do you accept everything else that's done this? Why don't you just turn around and say, no, you're not doing this no more? Edward VII died the latter part of 1910 from a heart attack. And we had a new king come to the throne, it was George V. And George V was a little bit green in the gills, supposedly. Didn't really understand the Constitution, plus he'd been taught by a Fabian. Sir Henry Martin, if I remember rightly. Anyway, cut a long story short, Asquith decided to present the 1911 bill to George V. He sent about 20 letters, private letters, went across from Asquith to King George. And these are all on the internet if you want to go and have a look for them, so you can actually see the wording that was used. If you get a little book by Roy Jenkins about the Liberal Party, you'll find that they boast about how Asquith persuaded the king. They boast about the fact. And I got that from Ashridge. I don't know if you've heard of Ashridge. Ashridge is a training college for Fabians in, is it Hertfordshire? It is Herts, isn't it? I just wondered if it crossed the border. And do you know what they actually, their business slogan, because it's a business school, do you know what their slogan is? Make money from global warming. Go and look it up yourself. Don't worry about global warming, make money from it. I happened to pick up this little book up there, because they've got a book thing that you just pay £1 for 3 or 4 books or whatever you buy, and we just happened to pick this book up. So what happened was, George V, this is what they needed to do. At the time, there was a Conservative majority within the House of Lords that was stopping all money bills going through. So what they needed to do was to take the powers away from them Lords. To do that, they created what's called a second chamber. The second chamber was to be filled with Liberal peers. This was the start of the process of what they call popular peer and not hereditary. If any of you know what Mr. Blair did, bless his heart, to the House of Lords a few years ago, what did he do? He booted out the rest of the hereditary peers. This process started in 1911. So what they did is they needed to get the majority within the House of Commons. It wasn't just good enough to get. Remember, they'd had a hung parliament. So in the last ever election in 1910 was the last time elections were spread over a week. I don't know if you know this, they used to take over a week. It was the last ever one. They needed to control the Commons. This is what Lloyd George and Churchill were up to. So they employed the services